In the first week of June 1924, a physiologist at the Harvard School of Public Health finished a report on a watch dial factory in Orange, New Jersey. His name was Cecil Drinker. The company had hired him itself, and his conclusions were not gentle. He had found radioactive dust on the workroom tables, in the air, on the workers' clothing, and in the workers themselves. He recommended immediate changes, and he wrote that the substance the women were handling every day appeared to be the cause of a disease that was already killing them. The state of New Jersey never saw that report. What the State Department of Labor received instead was a different version, filed by the company, carrying the weight of Harvard's name. In that version, the danger was gone. The dust was gone. One line summarized the medical findings of the entire study. Every girl is in perfect condition. 2 documents. The same factory, the same study, the same year. One of them was the truth, and one of them was shown to the government. For the next 4 years, women who trusted that clean version kept dying, one by one, of a disease their death certificates could not name. This is not a story about what a company failed to notice. The record shows something harder to sit with. It noticed, it wrote the notice down, and then it filed a cleaner story with the state. How a document like that stays hidden while people die, and what it finally took to drag the real version into a courtroom, is the question this film follows to the end. If records like this one deserve daylight, subscribing keeps this channel digging. It begins with a job. In the winter of 1917, that job was one of the best a working girl in New Jersey could get. Grace Fryer was 18 years old when she walked into the dial painting studio on Alden Street in Orange. Her father was a union delegate. Her family was large, respectable, and not rich, and the United States had just entered the war. 2 of her brothers would serve. Painting instrument dials so that soldiers could read their watches in the dark was steady work, patriotic work, and it paid better than almost anything else on offer. The arithmetic explains why the seats filled. A dial painter earned about 1.50 cents for every dial she finished. A quick worker could complete 250 dials in a day. That came to nearly $4 a day at a time when many working women in New Jersey brought home less than half of that. Some of the fastest painters out earned their own fathers. The company had its pick of applicants, and the studio hired girls as young as 14. Catherine Schaub was one of the 14-year-olds. She had started at the studio in the first days of February 1917, a small, lively girl from Newark, who liked music and dancing, and wanted, someday, to write. She thought the job was wonderful. Most of them did. The recruiting ran through kitchens and parish halls, sister bringing sister, cousin vouching for cousin, so that whole family trees ended up seated along the same tables. The Maggia family alone would send 3 daughters. Nobody recruits more effectively than a girl who comes home on Friday with more money than her father. The war gave the work a shine that money alone could not. A luminous dial was not a trinket in 1917. It was military equipment. The watches on soldiers' wrists, the instruments in aircraft, the sights on guns, all needed numbers a man could read in a trench at night without striking a match that could kill him. The girls painting those numbers were told, correctly, that the front depended on them. Some pinned photographs of soldier brothers and sweethearts at their places while they worked. The room itself did not look like a dangerous place. It looked like a schoolroom. Long tables under tall windows, rows of young women in cotton dresses, trays of tiny watch faces, and little crucibles of paint that glowed with a soft green light. The women called the material by its trade name, Undark. The company that made it was the United States Radium Corporation, and the ingredient that made the paint shine was radium, mixed a few grains at a time into zinc and glue. The technique came with the training, and the training took about a minute. A camel hair brush loses its point after a stroke or two. To repaint a fine line on a dial the size of a coin, the point has to come back. The instructresses taught each new girl the studio's 3-word rhythm: lip, dip, paint. Put the brush between your lips to sharpen the tip, dip it in the radium paint, and paint the numeral. A painter following that rhythm put the brush in her mouth hundreds of times a day, thousands of times a week. The brush was not even the only route. Each girl mixed her own supply of paint at her seat, tapping luminous powder from a vial into a little crucible and wetting it to a paste. Powder is not obedient. It rose off the mixing dishes and hung in the sunlit air of the studio, and it came down on hair, skin, sandwiches, and the rims of coffee cups. The women ate lunch at their work tables. By the end of a shift, a painter had swallowed radium she never saw. On top of the radium, she had licked off the brush on purpose. Some of the girls asked about it. The question was reasonable even then, because the paint had a strange habit of getting everywhere. It settled in their hair and on their dresses. It dusted their skin until they shimmered faintly in the dark. Some of the women wore their good dresses to the studio on purpose, so the fabric would glow at the dances that weekend. In Orange, people could recognize a dial painter walking home at night. The girls glowed, and the town thought it was glamorous, and so did they. The answers from the supervisors were consistent. The paint was harmless. A little radium was good for a person. Some of the girls swallowed it deliberately as a tonic, and nobody in authority told them to stop. One painter later remembered asking her manager directly whether the material could hurt her, and being told that it would put roses in her cheeks. One warning did reach the tables, and it is preserved because Grace Fryer remembered it for the rest of her life. Sabin von Sochaki, the company's founder and the inventor of the paint, passed through the studio one day and saw her point the brush with her lips. He told her not to do that. She would get sick, he said, and moved on. Grace did what any sensible 18-year-old would do with a confusing instruction. She asked her instructress about it. The answer came back that the paint was harmless and the doctor's remark meant nothing, and the rhythm resumed. The founder's warning and the floor's reassurance could not both be true. Nobody in the room that day knew she had just heard, in 2 sentences, the next 20 years of her life. That answer was not a fringe opinion in 1917. It was the market talking, and to understand how a poison ended up in the mouths of teenage girls, with the blessing of educated men, the story has to back up a few years. The whole Western world had fallen in love with a glowing metal. Radium had been isolated by Marie and Pierre Curie at the end of the 1890s, and it arrived in public life less like an element than like a miracle. It was the rarest and most expensive substance on Earth. A single gram sold for more than $100,000. It glowed without fuel. It burned without fire. And early medicine found that it could destroy tumors. If concentrated radium could kill cancer, the popular logic ran, then surely a trace of it could only do a body good. Business followed the logic. Pharmacies sold radium water as a tonic for energy. Cosmetic counters sold radium face creams. There were radium toothpastes that promised glowing smiles, radium chocolate on some European shelves, and clinics that offered radium treatments for everything from arthritis to low spirits. Almost none of these products contained enough radium to matter, which was the only merciful thing about them. The ones that did contain it would become famous later, in the worst possible way. The luminous paint itself became a consumer craze in miniature. Undark was advertised to the public as a small domestic miracle. Paint it on your light switch and never fumble in the dark again. Paint it on house numbers, on doorbells, on the pull chain of a lamp, on the dial of the alarm clock by the bed. There were luminous crucifixes for night tables and luminous eyes for children's toys. The advertisements presented the glow as clean, modern, and completely benign, a piece of the scientific future available at the hardware store. Every one of those advertisements was also, incidentally, an argument that the women who made the product had nothing to fear from it. The marketing and the workplace reassurance were the same sentence spoken in two rooms. The paint was different. The paint was real. A chemist and physician named Sabin von Sochocki had worked out a luminous compound that mixed genuine radium salts with zinc sulfide. In 1914, he helped found the company that became United States Radium. He was not a cynic. He believed in the element the way his era believed in it, and he handled so much of it himself that it had already cost him. The tip of his left index finger had been destroyed by radium burns, and he had cut part of it away. The war made his company essential. Luminous dials went onto soldiers' watches, aircraft instruments, gun sights, and ship gauges. By the end of the war, the studio in Orange had employed hundreds of dial painters. The United States and Canada together would eventually see several thousand young women pass through studios like it. The Orange plant processed the raw element on site. In the extraction rooms, men in the company's employ refined radium from carnotite ore, and the dust of the process drifted where dust drifts. Inside the company's own walls, the difference between the laboratory and the studio was instructive. The men who handled bulk radium in the laboratory used lead screens. Some wore lead-lined aprons and handled material with forceps. The chemists knew what concentrated radium did to skin because the burns on their own hands taught them. Von Sochocki himself would later say that radium was not to be trifled with. None of that equipment appeared in the painting studio. No screens, no aprons, no warnings, no rule against pointing the brush with the lips. The quantities in the paint were small. The reasoning went, far too small to burn anyone. What that reasoning missed, and what a handful of scientists already suspected, was that radium did not need to burn from the outside. Swallowed, it went somewhere much worse. The human body cannot tell radium from calcium. They are chemical cousins, close enough that the machinery of bone treats them the same way. Calcium swallowed in milk is carried to the skeleton and built into it. Radium swallowed off the tip of a paintbrush takes the same ride. It settles into the jaw, the spine, the hips, the long bones of the legs, and it stays. And unlike calcium, it does not lie still. Atom by atom, year after year, it fires radiation into the living bone around it, and into the marrow where blood is made. The slowness was the disguise. A poison that sickens on contact writes its own warning label. Radium gave no sign for years, because bone remodels slowly, and the damage compounded in silence. And by the time a first tooth ached, the skeleton that ached had been irradiating itself for half a decade. The same slowness that hid the crime would later be used to deny it, because the law's clocks and the public's attention were both built for fast injuries. Nearly everything cruel about this story comes back to that mismatch. The disease ran on geological patience. Every institution that judged it ran on calendars. Radium's half-life is about 1,600 years. A woman who swallowed it at 18 would carry an almost undiminished store of it at 80, if she lived to 80. Every dial painter who followed the studio rhythm was building a source of radiation into her own skeleton, an invisible trace at a time. Her body had no way to feel it happening. It had no way to get it out. Nobody in the studio knew that. It is worth being precise about who could have known. The scientific literature on radium's dangers was thin but not empty. Reports of harm to laboratory workers existed. The company's own founders and chemists treated the concentrated element with visible caution. What did not exist yet was proof of what small, swallowed, daily doses would do over years, because the women on Alden Street were the experiment that would supply it. For 5 years, the experiment ran quietly. The war ended. The studio kept painting, because luminous watches had become a civilian fashion. Grace Fryer left the studio in 1920 for a better position as a bank teller, healthy as far as she knew. She carried her savings and her good name. She also carried, in her bones, a quantity of radium that no doctor on earth yet knew how to measure. Then, in 1921 and 1922, in dentist chairs around Orange, the first bills came due. The first symptom, in case after case, was a toothache. It sounds almost harmless when it is said that way. A young woman in her early 20s goes to the dentist with an aching tooth. The dentist pulls it. The socket does not heal. Another tooth beside it begins to ache, and that one is pulled, and that socket does not heal either. Instead of closing, the wounds open wider. Ulcers form. The gum turns gray and breaks down, and then the trouble is no longer in the teeth at all. It is in the bone underneath. Amelia Maggia was one of the first to go through the whole course of it. Everyone called her Molly. She was one of 7 sisters in an Italian immigrant family, and at least 3 of the Maggia girls painted dials on Alden Street. She was a fast painter and a sociable one, and she left the studio with her health apparently intact. In 1921, her teeth began to fail. Her dentist did what dentists do, and everything he did made it worse. Extractions that would not close. Fragments of jawbone that came loose through the gum. Within a year, the lower jaw itself was crumbling. Her dentist would later describe lifting out sections of Molly's jawbone not with surgery, but with his fingers. The bone had gone soft, honeycombed from the inside, and the flesh around it would not stop bleeding. Molly Maggia died on the 12th of September, 1922. She was 24 years old. In her final weeks, the disease had reached her throat, and near the end, a hemorrhage from her mouth killed her quickly. Her family buried her in a cemetery in Orange, and her death certificate recorded a cause of death that would follow her name for 5 years: syphilis. Stop on that word, because the record did. To her family, the diagnosis was a humiliation stacked on a grief. To everyone else, it was an explanation that ended the conversation. A young woman dead of a shameful disease is a private tragedy, not a public question. Nobody audits a factory because of it. The certificate was wrong, and the proof that it was wrong existed in her bones at the moment it was signed. But paper does not correct itself. That single wrong word would protect the company for years, and it would take a court order and an exhumation to strike it out. Her dentist was not finished, though, and what he did next belongs in the history of evidence. Dr. Joseph Kneff had kept a fragment of the jaw he had been forced to remove, and he could not make the tissue's behavior match any disease he knew. Acting on a suspicion, he wrapped the bone fragment in a piece of unexposed dental film and set it aside. When he developed the film, it was fogged. The bone had exposed the film through the wrapping, by itself, in the dark. Neff did not yet have the vocabulary for what that meant, but he had performed, on his own initiative, one of the first pieces of physical detection in this entire story. A dead woman's bone was emitting something, and it could be made to leave a mark. The dentist's first educated guess had pointed somewhere else, and the dead end is instructive. Industrial medicine already knew one disease that destroyed workers' jaws: phosphorus necrosis, the match workers' horror called phossy jaw, had scandalized Europe and America a generation earlier, and the orange cases looked like its twin. But the dial studio used no phosphorus. The comparison was raised, checked against the company's materials, and dropped. The one profession that had seen something like this before was told, accurately, that the known cause was absent, and the inquiry stalled there. The right disease was hiding behind the wrong element. At the time, nobody connected her death to the studio, or if anyone did, the thought went nowhere on the record that survives. But Molly was not alone for long. Through 1923 and 1924, dentists in and around Orange kept meeting the same impossible mouth. Helen Quinlan, a dial painter, died in 1923, a young woman whose death record blamed a disease of the mouth. Irene Rudolph, who had painted dials alongside her cousin Catherine Schaub, died the same year after her own jaw disintegrated. Catherine herself, still in her early 20s, watched her cousin die of it and began waiting, tooth by tooth, to learn whether she was next. The dying was expensive, and the expense is part of the record. Hazel Cuser, another of the early painters, failed slowly through 1924, while her husband Theo paid for surgery after surgery. He mortgaged what the couple had. He borrowed against what they might ever have. She died in December of 1924, in her 20s, and he was left with the debt and the certificate. Families like the Cusers did not have the luxury of wondering about industrial causation. They were too busy selling furniture. One of the quiet cruelties of a slow poison is that it bankrupts its victims before it kills them. The fight for justice, when it finally becomes possible, must then be waged by people who have already lost everything. Two dentists in particular, Dr. Walter Berry and his colleagues, saw enough of these cases to stop believing in coincidence. The patients were all young women. The disease always began in the jaw. Ordinary infections did not behave this way, and the one thing the patients shared was a former employer. By 1924, the dentists and a county physician were saying so out loud, and the phrase people began to use around Orange was blunt. There was something wrong with the Radium plant. The company heard it too. Sales did not like rumors, and insurers liked them less. So in March of 1924, the United States Radium Corporation did something that, on paper, looks responsible. It commissioned an independent investigation by one of the most respected industrial health scientists in the country. This is the decision the whole story turns on, because from this point forward, the company can never again say it did not know. It asked the question itself, in writing, and paid for the answer. Cecil Drinker taught physiology at the Harvard School of Public Health. His wife, Dr. Catherine Drinker, was a physician and scientist in her own right, and together with a colleague they went into the Orange plant in the late spring of 1924. They examined the studio, the laboratory, the extraction works, and the workers. They ran blood counts on the dial painters. They tested the dust in the air and on the tables. They examined the men in the laboratory as well, including a chemist whose hands had been so damaged that lesions had formed on them. The company's motives for commissioning the study were not sentimental, and the file says so. Claims were beginning to surface. The firm's insurance carriers were asking questions, and officials in Trenton had made inquiries after the early deaths. A clean report from Harvard would settle the insurers, satisfy the state, and calm the workforce in a single stroke. That is what Arthur Roeder appears to have expected to receive. It is the only reading under which his later conduct makes commercial sense. What they found was a factory saturated with its own product. Luminous dust lay on the workroom surfaces. It clung to the painter's clothes and hair. When the investigators examined the workers in a darkened room, the women glowed. Dust in their hair, on their faces, on their arms, even in the fabric of their corsets glimmered in the dark. Nearly every worker they tested showed abnormal blood, changes in the composition of the blood cells of the kind radiation produces. The drinkers concluded that the material was the likely cause of the jaw disease that was killing the company's former painters, and they recommended protections. Cover the tables, ventilate the room, provide the painters with cloths, and, above all, the pointing of brushes in the mouth. The report went to the company president, Arthur Roeder, in June of 1924. What followed happened quietly, in correspondence and filing cabinets, and it is the reason this film exists. The company did not publish the report. It did not adopt the recommendations in any way the record shows the painters were told about. Roeder disputed the findings with Drinker by letter, suggested other explanations for the disease, and declined to release the study. And when the New Jersey Department of Labor asked about the investigation, what the department received, and what sat in the official file, was the version this film opened with. A summary, in which the hazards had been edited away, and in which the medical examination of the workforce had been reduced to one sentence. Every girl is in perfect condition. The state took the company's word for it. The file closed. The studio kept its rhythm. Lip, dip, paint. The women at the long tables under the tall windows were not told that a Harvard study of their own workplace had just concluded that the paint was probably killing them. It would be natural to ask where the state had been all this time, and the answer is that the state had visited. New Jersey's factory inspection system, like every such system of the era, was built to see the hazards of the previous century. Inspectors checked fire escapes, machine guards, sanitation, and hours. A clean, quiet, well-lit painting studio, full of healthy-looking young women, was by every checklist the inspectors carried, a model workplace. The most dangerous room in the state, photographed like the safest. Regulation, like medicine, could not yet see a hazard that arrived through a brush tip 5 years before its symptoms. While the company was managing its paperwork, the sick were beginning to manage theirs. In early 1925, Catherine Schaub walked her complaint in person to the public health authorities. She had buried her cousin. She had begun losing her own teeth. Her filing put the studio on the official record from the workers' side for the first time. Nothing dramatic followed immediately. Complaints from working-class girls rarely moved departments in 1925, but the filing existed now. A small, stubborn counterweight in the same government files that held the company's clean version, and investigators who came later would find both. The investigator who mattered most at this stage was not a government official at all. Catherine Wiley of the Consumers League had begun going door to door in Orange, notebook in hand. Her organization was a private reform league staffed largely by women. Her project was a list of sick and dead dial painters, built household by household. It was slow, unpaid, unglamorous work, and it produced the first honest census of the disaster. Wiley took her list to the state, to the newspapers, and to the scientists, and she kept adding names. If the company's method was to control what entered the record, Wiley's method was the opposite. Write everything down and hand it to everyone, The falsified filing might never have surfaced at all but for a network of people the company did not control. Catherine Wiley, of the New Jersey Consumers League, had begun her own inquiry into the Orange deaths and was pushing the state to act. Dr. Alice Hamilton of Harvard, the country's leading investigator of industrial poisons, was advising her, and Alice Hamilton knew the drinkers personally. Early in 1925, she compared notes with them, and the two versions of the report met each other in daylight for the first time. Hamilton wrote to Catherine Drinker with the discovery. The company had told the Department of Labor that the Drinker study cleared it, and the department could quote the filing to prove it. Cecil Drinker was being used as a shield for the very hazard he had documented, and he knew it. Roeder warned that publication would expose Drinker to legal action. Drinker weighed the threat and published anyway. In the August of 1925, the real findings appeared in a scientific journal for anyone to read. The New Jersey authorities were confronted with the gap between what had been filed with them and what Harvard had found. They ordered changes at the plant. Lip pointing was to end. It is worth pausing on the size of the delay, because the delay is the crime inside the crime. The true report was finished. In the June of 1924, the truth became public 14 months later. Count that. Through every one of those months, the studio ran. The brushes were pointed the old way for most of that time, and the women inside were reassured with a document their own employer knew to be false. Marguerite Carlo, a painter who had fallen ill while still employed at the plant, spent those months watching her own jaw begin to fail. Her medical bills were mounting, while the state file said the girls were in perfect condition. By then, the disease finally had a name, and a man determined to prove it in a way no company lawyer could argue with. Others were converging on the same conclusion by different roads. Frederick Hoffman, a statistician for the Prudential Insurance Company, had begun tracing the Orange deaths in 1924 at the Consumers League's urging. He was a numbers man, not a physician, and numbers were exactly what the case needed. In 1925, he presented his findings to the American Medical Association and said plainly that the dial painter's disease was occupational. An insurance statistician had just told the medical profession, in its own house, that a workplace was killing its workers. The companies could dismiss sick girls and hired reformers. A prudential man with mortality tables was harder to wave away. Harrison Martland was the chief medical examiner of Essex County, New Jersey, and he was the kind of pathologist other pathologists deferred to. He had no stake in Radium, no contract with the company, and no patience for diagnosis by reassurance. In the spring of 1925, the Orange cases landed on his desk in the most direct way a case can land on a medical examiner's desk. People were dying inside his county, of something medicine could not name, and the dying had a common employer. The case that forced the issue was not a dial painter, but a company chemist. Dr. Edwin Lehman, the chief chemist of United States Radium, died in June of 1925. He had spent years handling the concentrated element behind the laboratory's lead screens, and it killed him anyway, through his blood. Days before Lehman died, Martland examined him and began designing tests that had never been run on a living patient before. The insight was simple and terrible. If radium was inside these people, it was not going to show itself in symptoms alone. It would have to be caught in the act of radiating. Radium in the skeleton decays into a radioactive gas called radon, and that gas leaves the body on the breath. So Martland sat his patients down and had them breathe into flasks, and he measured the radioactivity of what came out. Then he held detection instruments against their bones and measured again. The first dial painter he tested this way was Sarah Malefer, who was by then too sick to be anything but a hospital patient. She was also, and this mattered, Marguerite Carlo's sister. The two had shared the same workroom, and while Marguerite's lawsuit inched through the machinery, Sarah declined faster. Her breath was radioactive. Her bones were radioactive through her living skin. She died within days of the test, and Martland performed the autopsy and measured her bones directly. The radium was there, in quantities no human skeleton should contain, still firing. For the first time, the disease had a mechanism, a measurement, and a name. Martland called it radium poisoning, and he said in public what the altered file in Trenton had been constructed to prevent anyone from saying. The paint was the cause. The women were not sick in their imaginations or their morals. They were sick in their bones, and the proof could be read on an instrument by anyone the company could not fire. Martland's tests also carried a sentence inside them, and he did not hide it. Radium, once fixed in bone, could not be removed. No drug reached it. No surgery could scrape a skeleton, and the half-life ran to centuries. A woman whose breath turned the instrument was not a patient with a prognosis. She was a person in whom the cause of death had already been installed, waiting. Martland began keeping a list of the living who tested positive. The newspapers, when they learned of it later, would call it what it was, a list of the doomed. Martland published what he had found, with measurements, in the leading medical journal of the country, and the science held. Other laboratories repeated the tests. The gamma radiation coming off a poisoned woman could be registered by an electroscope held near her body, without touching her, a fact that is almost unbearable to think about and impossible to argue with. The company's response was to attack the messenger. Its officials and hired experts disputed Martland's methods, questioned his motives, and continued for years to deny that any such disease existed. Martland, for his part, kept measuring. He had the advantage that belongs to every honest record keeper in this story. He did not need anyone's agreement. The company's response to all this was not silence. It was science, or the costume of it. United States Radium retained an industrial hygiene specialist from Columbia University named Frederick Flynn. Flynn held a doctorate, and dial painters who were sent to him for examination reasonably assumed the doctorate was in medicine. It was not. He was not a physician at all, and what the women also did not know was that his work was paid for by the company whose product was under suspicion. Flynn examined sick women and told them they were in fine health. Grace Fryer sat for one of those examinations. She had been sent by the company after her own doctors raised the question, and the man she believed to be a physician pronounced her health better than that of most women her age. Her spine was collapsing at the time. He told Catherine Schaub, whose cousin had died of the disease, that her own examination was satisfactory. He published articles doubting that radium had anything to do with the deaths, suggesting instead infections of the mouth, or nerves, or nothing. For a young woman frightened for her life, a reassuring examination from a Columbia expert was not a small thing. It sent some of them home to wait, quietly, while the window for legal action closed over their heads. One measurement from Martland's early series deserves its own line. Among the people he tested was Sabin von Sochocki, the inventor of the paint. The breath of the man who had created Undark carried some of the highest readings Martland recorded. Von Sochocki understood the instrument, understood the physics, and understood, therefore, exactly what the number meant for him. From that point forward, the inventor cooperated with the investigation of his own invention. It is one of the few moments in this story where knowledge and conscience arrived in the same man at the same time. Because there was a window, and it was brutally small. New Jersey's compensation law recognized a short list of occupational diseases, and radium poisoning was not on it, for the excellent reason that the disease had not existed on paper until Martland invented the proof. Outside that list, an injured worker's only road was an ordinary lawsuit, and ordinary lawsuits in New Jersey came with a statute of limitations of 2 years from the injury. It is worth explaining the machine for a modern viewer, because the machine is the villain's best friend in both halves of this story. Workers' compensation, the great reform of the era, was a trade. Workers gave up the right to sue in exchange for automatic, scheduled payments for listed injuries. The list was the catch. A lost hand was on it. A crushed foot was on it. A disease nobody had named yet was not. And a disease excluded from the list fell back into the ordinary courts, where the company could bring lawyers, delays, and clocks. The system was not broken when it failed the dial painters. It was operating exactly as written. The women were not fighting a loophole. They were fighting the design. Sit with the arithmetic of that rule as it applied to a dial painter. The radium entered her body in her teens during the war. The first toothache came 5 years later. The diagnosis later still, if it came at all. By any reading, the injury had happened years before the victim could possibly have known it existed. By the plain text of the law, her right to sue had expired before her first symptom. The disease was slower than the deadline, and the company's lawyers understood that perfectly. So did the lawyers who kept turning the women away. Through 1925 and 1926, sick painters looked for representation and found doors closing gently in their faces. The case was unwinnable, they were told. The science was new. The defendant was rich. The statute had run. Marguerite Carlo had managed to file while still inside the 2-year window, because her illness had begun while she was still on the payroll. The company eventually settled her claim, and a handful of others quietly, admitting nothing, while publicly maintaining that the paint was harmless. The settlements bought silence at retail. The statute promised silence wholesale. Institutions keep 2 kinds of records: the ones they publish and the ones they generate. The published kind can be shaped. The generated kind, correspondence, invoices, examination results, filings, accumulates in drawers with no sense of loyalty, waiting for a subpoena to give it a voice. Everything that happens in the second half of this story is, at bottom, a contest over which kind of record would define the truth. Grace Fryer did not accept the arrangement. Her health had begun failing in 1925. First her feet, then her back. Doctors found her spine was being crushed from within, the vertebrae collapsing, and she was fitted with a steel back brace to hold her upright. She had left the studio 6 years earlier for the bank. She had done everything right, and she now understood that the job she held at 18 had been quietly demolishing her skeleton ever since. She wanted a lawyer, not a settlement. It took her 2 years to find one willing to try. In 1927, she found Raymond Barry, a young attorney in Newark, willing to take the case on contingency and willing to spend himself on it. Barry saw the path the older lawyers had refused to walk. The statute of limitations began, he would argue, not when the poison was swallowed, but when the victim discovered, or could reasonably have discovered, what had been done to her. A woman cannot be time-barred out of a wrong she had no way of knowing existed. It was an argument at the frontier of the law, and if it failed, everything failed with it. Word of Grace's search traveled the way everything traveled among the painters, through kitchens and sick rooms. Catherine Schaub, who had been filing complaints since 1925 and watching them sink, joined her. So did Edna Hussman, and so did the two surviving Maggia sisters, Quinta MacDonald and Albina Larice, whose family had already given the studio a daughter and been handed a slander on a death certificate in return. 5 women, all of them sick, none of them wealthy, agreed to put their names on a public accusation against a corporation in an era when respectable women avoided courtrooms entirely. The decision looks inevitable now. It was not. It was 5 separate acts of nerve, made in 5 separate parlors, by women who had every reason to believe they would lose. Barry was young enough to be underestimated and thorough enough to make that a mistake. Before filing, he assembled the case, the way the company had never expected anyone to bother to. He collected the medical files. He located former employees. He obtained the published drinker study and set it beside what the state had been told, and he understood precisely what that comparison would do in front of a jury. The company had spent years betting that no plaintiff could afford the fight and no lawyer would fund it. Barry took the case on a contingent fee, meaning he would be paid from a victory or not at all, and started spending his own money on experts. In May of 1927, Barry filed suit against the United States Radium Corporation on behalf of Grace Fryer. 4 other women joined her: Catherine Schaub, who had watched her cousin die of the disease, Edna Hussman, and 2 married sisters of Molly Maggia, Quinta MacDonald and Albina Larice, who had painted at the same tables their sister had. Each of the 5 asked for $250,000. The newspapers counted 5 dying plaintiffs and gave them a name that stuck: the Radium Girls. The company's defense had 3 walls: the statute of limitations, the claim that the science connecting paint to disease was unproven, and, where nothing else served, the suggestion that the women's illnesses came from other causes entirely, with syphilis available on at least 1 death certificate to gesture at. That certificate belonged to Molly Maggia, 5 years in her grave. Barry decided to open the grave. It was a drastic move, and Barry knew exactly what he was buying with it. A living witness can be doubted. Experts can be hired against her. But the defense had put a specific medical claim on a specific death certificate, and that claim could be tested with a shovel and a laboratory. Her family consented at once. They had lived under that certificate for 5 years, in a neighborhood where everyone could read what it said, and they wanted it broken almost as much as the case did. On the 15th of October, 1927, in the presence of officials and physicians, Molly Maggia was exhumed from the cemetery in Orange. Her coffin was raised and opened. Witnesses saw what 5 years of burial had not put out. The inside of the coffin and the remains themselves glowed with a soft, unmistakable luminescence. The instruments confirmed what the glow announced. Her bones were intensely radioactive, in nearly every location tested, holding radium at hundreds of times any level then considered survivable. The examination also did what her family had wanted for 5 years. It ruled out syphilis. The disease on the certificate was not in the body. The disease in the body was in no certificate, and it had a single commercial source. A dead woman had been recalled to testify, and her testimony could not be cross-examined, impeached, or reassured into silence. She had become, in the most literal sense in American legal history to that point, evidence. Something shifts in the story here, and it is worth naming plainly. Until the exhumation, the case was a contest of accounts. Sick women said one thing, company experts said another, and the falsified file in Trenton sat on the company's side of the scale. After the exhumation, the record itself began to testify. Bones, instruments, journal articles, breath in glass flasks. The question was no longer whether the women were telling the truth. The question was whether any institution in New Jersey was equipped to do anything about it, and the answer to that question was about to embarrass the country. Getting a court date at all had been its own fight. The company's lawyers moved at the ordinary pace of civil litigation, which is to say, at a pace calibrated to outlast plaintiffs with prognoses. Barry pushed for expedition on the only honest ground available, that his clients were dying, and physicians' estimates of their remaining time entered the court file as scheduling arguments. The hearings opened in January of 1928 in Newark, in the Court of Chancery. What the courtroom saw first was not testimony. It was the plaintiffs arriving. Grace Fryer came in her steel back brace, upright because the brace allowed nothing else. Quinta MacDonald and Albina Lariche were largely beyond walking unaided. Catherine Schaub was frail enough that reporters remarked on it. And when the moment came to swear the witnesses, two of the women could not raise their arms to take the oath. The gesture was beyond the reach of their ruined shoulders. Court officers accommodated them, and the reporters in the room wrote it down, and that one detail traveled further in the public mind than 100 pages of chemistry. Grace Fryer testified about the studio, the training, and the years since. She described the reassurances she had been given as a teenager. Then she described her present life, the operations on her spine, the brace she could not sit up in bed without, the working days she still put in at the bank, because her family needed them. The lawyers on the other side had the unenviable task of cross-examining a composed, obviously honest, obviously dying young woman. And the transcripts and the newspapers agree on how that went. She did not break. She had waited 2 years for a lawyer and 5 years for this room, and she answered everything. The other 4 gave the court their own inventories. Edna Hussman told the court about the home she and her husband had built, and the nurse her condition now required, and that she knew what her diagnosis meant. Quinta MacDonald, who had buried her sister Molly 6 years earlier, and then attended the exhumation that vindicated her, testified through the fatigue of a body giving out. Albina Lariche, the third of the Maggia sisters in this story, had lost children in pregnancy as the radium did its work, a grief the era barely had language for, and the courtroom heard in near silence. None of it was theatrical. That was its power. The plaintiffs were not performing dying. They were dying, on a schedule their own physicians had estimated for the record. The story went around the world. Papers in London and Paris and Berlin carried the case of the poisoned American watch painters. In an era that had just industrialized death in a world war, something about 5 specific women, with names and photographs and month-by-month prognoses, cut through in a way statistics never had. Letters arrived in orange from strangers on other continents. Quack healers offered miracle treatments. A French physician proposed a serum. The women read their own obituaries in draft, daily, in a dozen languages. The testimony built the story the public had never been shown in order. The training, the rhythm of the brush, the reassurances. The dentists described jaws that came apart in their hands. Martland explained breath that turned instruments, and bones that exposed photographic plates, and the paper record began to surface, piece by piece, including the study the company had commissioned from Harvard, and the cleaner account of it that had reached the state. The company's answer remained what it had always been. The science was uncertain. The diseases had other causes, and whatever the truth of it, the clock had run out years ago. Then, in April, with the plaintiffs visibly failing, the court granted an adjournment. Several of the company's expert witnesses were unavailable, the defense explained, because they were traveling in Europe for the summer. The case of 5 dying women would resume in September. The reaction did not stay in New Jersey. The story had been gathering national attention for months, and the summer adjournment turned attention into fury. Newspapers across the country took it up. Walter Lippmann, then among the most influential editorial voices in America, wrote that the delay was a damnable travesty of justice, and public figures joined in. From Paris, Marie Curie herself was asked about the case, and expressed her sympathy, though she could offer no cure. The spectacle was too plain to explain away. On one side of the scale sat summer plans. On the other sat 5 women whose physicians were being asked, in print, how many months each had left. Under that pressure, the court moved the resumption forward, and a federal judge named William Clark volunteered to mediate a settlement before trial. Raymond Barry had reasons for caution. A trial could set the precedent that would protect every poisoned worker after them. A settlement would set none. But his clients were dying at a speed the docket did not respect, and money now meant care now. There was one more thing about the mediator that the moment did not advertise. Judge Clark, it later emerged, was himself a stockholder in the United States Radium Corporation. No rule required him to say so, which is itself a fact about the era worth keeping. The settlement he brokered would be reported by most of the press as a triumph for the women, and in the same week, trade publications assured the radium industry that nothing had been legally admitted or scientifically settled. Both stories were technically true. That was the design. The corporation itself went on. Dial production shifted away from Orange, and the company carried its business into other states and other decades under the same name. There was no corporate death sentence in this story, no dissolution, no criminal charge against any officer, ever, in either state. The men who had commissioned the study, received it, and filed its opposite with the government, retired in the ordinary way of executives. Whatever accountability this story contains, the reader should understand now, was extracted by sick women in civil forums, dollar by dollar. The criminal law of the era simply had no shelf for any of it. The settlement was reached in early June of 1928, days before the trial date. Each of the 5 women received $10,000 in cash, a pension of $600 a year for life, and payment of her past and future medical and legal expenses. The company admitted nothing. $10,000 in 1928 was real money, several years of a skilled man's wages, enough to buy a house, set against 5 years of surgeries already endured, and the care still coming. It was also, by any honest accounting, a discount on what a jury might have done with the forged report in evidence. And inside the agreement sat a condition that tells you who held the pen. The annual pension continued only so long as physicians examined the women and found them still suffering from radium poisoning, and the examining physicians were subject to the company's approval. The corporation that had told the state every girl was in perfect condition retained a say in deciding, year by year, whether the girls it had poisoned were sick enough to keep being paid. The women took the settlement because dying people do not get to litigate on principle. The public treated it as their victory, and in the ways that could still matter to them, it was. The payments funded doctors, nurses, and some ease. It did not fund time. What the settlement bought each of the 5, in practice, was a strange, monitored afterlife. The annual examinations began, conducted under the arrangement the company had approved, and the women learned to live inside their terms. There were disputes in the years that followed about what the examiners found and what the findings meant for the payments, and the women discovered that even dying could be audited. Catherine Schaub, who had dreamed since girlhood of writing, did the most defiant thing available to a person in her position. She wrote it down. She published an account of her own poisoning and her own case, in her own voice, while the disease worked through her. The company had spent years speaking about the dial painters through experts and filings. Now one of the dial painters had entered the record herself, in the first person, where no examiner could edit her. Her plans were almost unbearably modest. With her settlement, she hoped for a little house of her own, quiet, with a garden, somewhere to write. She took courses. She kept notebooks. The disease kept its own schedule alongside hers, and the race between the cottage and the diagnosis is one of the small private tragedies folded inside the public one. Very little of what the five bought with their $10,000 was luxury. They bought nurses, mortgages settled, siblings helped, and short stretches of ordinary life purchased at extraordinary prices. Grace Fryer gave the reporters who visited her a sentence that belongs in the permanent file of this story. It was not the money that mattered, she told them, but the principle, the establishment that the thing had happened and that the ones it happened to had been right. She continued working at the bank as long as her spine allowed. Photographs from those years show her carefully dressed, carefully upright, the brace invisible under her clothes, a woman insisting on ordinariness with extraordinary effort. The clock the doctors had started ran anyway. Quinta MacDonald, who had already lost her sister Molly to the disease, was dead by the end of the following year, leaving her children behind. Grace Fryer worked at her bank almost to the end. She met the reporters, who kept calling with the same composure she had shown the company's lawyers. She died in the fall of 1933, at 34 years old. The papers that had followed her for 6 years wrote about her the way papers write about generals. Catherine Schaub followed within months. In her mid-30s, her book finished and her case cited. Edna Hussman kept her home as long as her body allowed and died in her 30s. Albina Larice carried the disease longest of the five, into the 1940s, the last survivor of a lawsuit whose famous name outlived nearly everyone it named. Count what the Maggia family alone had paid by then. One daughter dead at 24 with a slander on her certificate. A second dead at 34 after the exhumation of the first. A third living out her years with radium in her spine, and 2 sisters in the ground. One family, one studio, one product. The newspapers that had called the five doomed had not been wrong. They had only been early. Their case ended in a settlement, but it did not end quietly, and it did not end alone. Martlin's list of the marked kept growing through the late 20s as more former painters sickened. Further suits followed against the company, each one now armed with the published science and the public record the first five had created. In December of 1928, the federal government convened a national conference on radium poisoning in Washington, pulling together the scientists, the officials, and the industry. The Federal Labor Statistics Bureau, under Ethelbert Stewart, had already run its own investigation of the dial painting trade and confirmed the pattern the companies had spent years denying. Out of that reckoning came the industry's formal abandonment of lip pointing and the beginnings of actual working standards. None of it was volunteered. Every line of it had been extracted from underneath the statute of limitations by women who were told they had no case. 5 months after the settlement, the story claimed a different kind of casualty. Sabin von Sochacki, the physician who had invented the paint and helped found the company, died in November of 1928 of aplastic anemia, his blood destroyed by the element he had believed in. he had tested as heavily contaminated as the worst of the dial painters. And in his last years, he had crossed the aisle, assisting Martland's investigations and supporting the women's cause. The finger he had cut away years earlier had been the warning. The rest of his body had absorbed the lesson too slowly. The inventor and the painters, whatever else divided them, were buried carrying the same element. By 1932, the wider world received its own unmistakable lesson in what swallowed radium did, and it came with a millionaire attached. Eben Byers, a Pittsburgh industrialist and amateur golf champion, had spent years drinking a patent tonic called Radithor, radium dissolved in water, sold in little bottles as a source of vigor. He drank it by the case on his physician's recommendation, some 1,400 bottles over 5 years, and he recommended it to friends the way rich men recommend good brokers. When federal investigators finally took his testimony in 1931, he was too ill to travel, and the questioning was conducted at his home. He died in March of 1932, with his jaw largely gone, and he was buried in a lead-lined coffin, and the federal government finally moved against radium patent medicines. A newspaper line from the era summarized the case with a cruelty that stuck. The radium water worked fine until his jaw came off. What the dial painters had been telling courts for 5 years, a rich man's death made respectable in 1 season. The Radithor story deserves 1 more minute because it shows the same machinery from a different angle. The tonic's maker, William Bailey, was a salesman of scientific confidence who had built a business on the era's faith in the element, and he had sold hundreds of thousands of bottles at $1 apiece to people seeking energy, health, and youth. Eben Byers drank some 1,400 of them. When the federal trade authorities finally acted, and the medical associations stripped radium remedies of their respectability, Bailey himself faced no criminal penalty. He protested to the end that he had drunk as much of his own product as anyone. The era of radium as medicine closed, not with a verdict, but with a market collapse, and the distinction matters. The law never caught up with the tonic men. Their customers simply stopped appearing, and so did some of them, into early graves that nobody audited. For the dial companies, the 1930s brought a different kind of arithmetic. Cheaper radium from new mines abroad broke the price that had made the element precious, cutting it to a fraction of its old fortune within a few years. The industry that had once measured its product in grams worth fortunes now competed on volume. The glamour was gone, the lawsuits were public, and the science was in the journals. What remained was the work itself, which still needed doing, and a workforce that still needed wages. Dial painting did not end. It changed its manners. And whether those manners actually protected the next generation of painters depended entirely on which building a woman happened to walk into. It would be comforting to report that the industry learned. What the record shows is narrower and colder. The New Jersey studio changed its practices. The lawsuits and the science made lip-pointing indefensible, and dial painting continued with precautions that would tighten over decades. The lesson that was fully learned was commercial. Radium tonics died in the marketplace. But 4 years before Eben Byers died, and 800 miles west of Orange, another company had already shown exactly how much of the New Jersey story it intended to repeat. It had done so with the New Jersey evidence sitting in front of it. If New Jersey was a scandal, what happened in Illinois was closer to a policy, because it happened after the scandal, in full view of it. The town was Ottawa, Illinois, on the Illinois River southwest of Chicago. The company was Radium Dial, a competitor of the New Jersey firm, and it had opened its painting studio there in the early 1920s, in a converted high school building. It recruited the daughters of working Ottawa, Catholic girls from big families, and it paid the same wonderful wages, and its instructresses taught the same 3 words: lip, dip, paint. This was after Molly Maggia's death, after the drinker report, after Martland's measurements had been published in the medical literature and reported in the press. The Ottawa women asked about New Jersey, because the New Jersey story was in the newspapers by 1925 and impossible to miss by 1928. The company's answers came in 2 forms. The first was reassurance in person, the same roses in your cheeks currency that had circulated in Orange a decade earlier. The second was reassurance in print, and it survives. In the summer of 1928, days after the New Jersey settlement made national headlines, Radium Dial took out a full-page advertisement in the Ottawa newspaper. It assured its employees and their families that the paint used in Ottawa was different, that conditions were safe, and that if the company ever had reason to believe the work endangered anyone's health, it would suspend operations at once. Here is what the company did not print. It had already tested its own workers. Physical examinations of the Ottawa painters had been conducted for the company in 1925 and again in 1928, and the results were never given to the women. Some of those results showed exactly what the company was publicly denying: the early signatures of radium in the body. The women were examined, found marked, reassured, and sent back to the tables. The forged report in Trenton at least required forgery. In Ottawa, the cleaner method was silence. One of the women at those tables was named Catherine Wolfe. She had started at Radium Dial in 1922, at 19, a quiet, devout young woman supporting herself. She would marry Thomas Donahue and become Catherine Donahue. She would keep painting dials for 9 years. This film will stay with her to the end, because the country's second radium fight would run through her sickbed. To understand what happened in Ottawa, it helps to see the studio the way the town saw it. The Radium Dial Company had taken over the old high school building on Columbus Street, and through the 20s, its big upstairs room was one of the brightest workplaces in town, in every sense. Rows of long tables, tall windows for the light. At its peak, the studio employed on the order of 100 girls at a time, and over the years several hundred Ottawa women passed through it. The pay explains the rest. Ottawa was a railroad and farm town, and the studio's piece rates let a quick painter earn more than her father brought home from the yards. When the Depression arrived at the end of the decade, those wages stopped being attractive and became something closer to holy. A girl with a place at the tables was keeping her family fed. Whatever quiet doubts a family had about the glowing dust on a daughter's dress, the envelope she brought home on Friday argued louder. That is not a judgment on the families. It is a description of the trap. By 1931, a quarter of the American workforce was heading toward idleness, and Ottawa's alternatives were the shuttered glass factory and the waiting list at the works. A woman who suspected the studio and quit anyway was volunteering her family for hunger on the strength of a rumor her employer, her newspaper, and the company's full-page advertisements all denied. The studio never needed to threaten anyone. The year did the threatening. The women themselves were close in the way small towns build closeness. Many had gone to school together in the very building they now painted in. They were sisters, cousins, neighbors, and pewmates. Catherine Wolfe walked to work from her uncle's house and to St. Columba's Church on Sundays. Charlotte Nevins had signed on at 16. Marie Becker, quick and funny, would remember the studio as a place of gossip and laughter, where the girls painted their teeth and their buttons with the leftover paint for a joke and went home shining. Ottawa had a name for them: The ghost girls. On dark evenings, they glowed faintly on the sidewalks, and their dresses glowed in their closets at night, and the town found it charming. The word would keep its accuracy longer than its charm. The studio had arrived in town the ordinary way, with advertisements. Girls wanted, for fine brushwork, no experience necessary, good pay. The woman who ran the studio floor, Miss Lottie Murray, was herself a believer who told her painters the material was safe, and the town had no reason to doubt a neighbor. Catherine Wolfe met Thomas Donahue while she worked there, a quiet courtship conducted at church and at the studio door, and married him in 1932. Their wedding photograph shows a slender, dark-haired woman with careful eyes. She was already limping by then. She believed, because she had been told, that the limp had nothing to do with the paint. They did the same things the Orange Girls had done, because they had been taught the same way, by a company that had watched the Orange story unfold in the national press. That is the fact to hold on to through everything that follows. Every practice that a Harvard study had condemned in New Jersey in 1924 was still standard instruction in Illinois. Years later, the brush to the lips, the bare tables, the dust. Some of the Ottawa women read newspaper accounts of the New Jersey lawsuits and asked their superintendent about it. They were told the New Jersey trouble was a different paint and a different company. There was, they were told, nothing in Ottawa to worry about. The first Ottawa deaths began before the New Jersey case had even settled. In 1926 and 1927, a young painter named Ella Cruz died with the disease's signature in her jaw, and her death was attributed to other causes. Then, in August of 1929, the studio lost one of its favorites. Margaret Looney, called Peg, was one of 10 children from an Irish family, a bright girl who had wanted to be a school teacher and painted dials to help feed her brothers and sisters. She was 24 when she died, wasted and anemic, with her jaw failing. What happened around Peg Looney's death is one of the coldest sequences in this entire record. The company arranged the autopsy. Its own doctors controlled the examination, and the cause of death that reached the public was diphtheria. Her family did not believe it and could not disprove it. They would wait almost 50 years for the truth, and when it finally came, it would come from a federal laboratory with instruments pressed against her exhumed bones. What those instruments found, this film will come to. For 1929, the record reads simply, "A dial painter died." The company's physicians signed the story, and the tables filled again on Monday. Catherine Wolfe was still at those tables. Through the late 20s, her own body had begun sending the early messages. An ache in her hip, a limp that came and stayed. She painted anyway, because the wages were survival, and in 1931, the company solved the problem of her visible decline in its own way. She was let go. The reason given, as she and others later recounted it, was that her limp had become conspicuous, and it did not look well for a Radium company to have a limping painter on the floor. She had given the studio 9 years. In 1932, she married Thomas Donahue, a hard-working, gentle man who loved her plainly, and they had 2 children, and her body kept failing on schedule. By the middle of the 30s, the pattern in Ottawa was no longer possible to call coincidence, because it was the New Jersey pattern replaying line by line, teeth, then jaws, then hips and spines. Doctors who examined the sick women found what Martland had taught the profession to find. Some told their patients honestly. At least one Ottawa physician, consulting for the company, examined dying women and offered reassurance while reporting elsewhere that the cases looked like radium. The women compared notes at kitchen tables and church suppers, and counted the dead on their fingers, and understood. The truth reached the Ottawa women the way it had reached New Jersey, through an honest outside doctor. A Chicago specialist named Charles Loeffler examined several of the painters in the middle 30s and told them what their own bodies had been arguing for years. This was radium. It was occupational. It was, by then, a described disease with a 15-year medical literature, and the women of Ottawa had spent that same 15 years being told the literature did not apply to their studio. Catherine Donahue received her diagnosis and did the arithmetic every dial painter eventually did, backwards through every reassurance she had ever been given, and forward through her 2 small children. The company they faced was, by then, partly a ghost. Radium Dial's leadership had read the same pattern and drawn the businessman's conclusion. In 1934, the company's president, Joseph Kelly, was involved in setting up a new dial painting firm across town called Luminous Processes, and Radium Dial itself wound down its Ottawa operation and moved what remained beyond easy reach. When the Ottawa women finally got their day before a tribunal, they would discover that the corporate defendant had thinned itself to a name, a contested bond, and a set of lawyers whose instructions were to concede nothing and outlast everyone. Against that machine stood a group of women who could no longer work, could barely walk, and had, on paper, no case. Illinois law in the early 30s gave an occupational disease claim a narrow door, and the company argued the now familiar clocks and categories. Too late. Wrong statute. Unproven science. Lawyer after lawyer in Chicago declined. The women had almost nothing to pay with. The defendant had almost nothing left to seize, and the precedents were hostile. It was 1926, in New Jersey, all over again, except that these plaintiffs were poorer, farther from the newspapers, and sick with the same disease. The law of Illinois shifted under them while they organized, and the shift cut both ways. In 1936, the state passed a modern Occupational Disease Act, pushed along by the growing scandal. It would protect the next generation. For the women already poisoned, the state's legal machinery still offered only narrow, time-barred doors, and the company contested every one of them. The women needed a route that could reach back years, and a lawyer willing to fight a case whose fee might be nothing. They organized anyway. A core of them began meeting in each other's front rooms to pool information and look for help. Catherine Donahue, Charlotte Purcell, who had lost her left arm at the shoulder in a surgical gamble to stop the disease, and would live with that trade for half a century more. Marie Rossiter, the Glasinski sisters, and a handful of others. Pearl Payne, a nurse by training who had painted only briefly, became the group's record keeper. She wrote the letters, kept the clippings, and saved the correspondence, and her boxes of paper would eventually help historians reconstruct what the company preferred to leave unwritten. The Chicago newspapers found the group in 1937 and took up the cause with full front-page force, printing the women's photographs, their medical bills, and their prognoses, beside the company's old assurances. The Chicago Press, when it found them, gave the group a name that was almost too on the nose to print, and printed it anyway. The Society of the Living Dead. The photographs that ran with the stories show ordinary women in Sunday dresses, thin, seated because standing cost too much, looking straight at the camera. The Society's business was practical. The women pooled information about doctors and shared the long rides to Chicago specialists. They compared symptoms so that no one faced a new stage of the disease without a map. They minded each other's children during hospital stays. Solidarity is usually narrated as marching, Here it looked like casseroles, borrowed cars, and a nurse named Pearl keeping the files straight. It was, in miniature, everything their employer was supposed to have been and was not. An institution that told its members the truth. Help finally arrived in the person of Leonard Grossman, a Chicago attorney with a taste for lost causes and a conscience that overrode his bookkeeping. He took the case, knowing his clients could not pay him, and for years he largely was not paid. His argument would run through the Illinois Industrial Commission rather than the courts, under the state's occupational disease provisions, and it would rest on the same moral spine Raymond Barry had used in New Jersey. The company knew. The workers were never told. A clock that starts before knowledge is possible is not a limitation period. It is a trap door. And in Catherine Donahue, Grossman had a client whose body was itself the state's evidence. By 1937, she weighed less than she had as a schoolgirl. Radium had honeycombed her jaw, and fragments of the bone had begun coming away in her mouth. She kept some of them in a small box at home, because she understood, with a clarity that is hard to look at directly, that pieces of her own skeleton might be the exhibit that won her family its future. The hearing was set for February of 1938, in the council chamber of the Ottawa City Hall, a few blocks from the studio where she had learned the rhythm. Lip, dip, paint. She insisted on being there. On the morning of the hearing, Catherine Donahue could not walk the distance from the car to the council chamber. Her husband carried her. Reporters who covered the proceedings recorded what the room saw. A woman in her mid-30s, who weighed about 70 pounds, folded into a chair beside her lawyer, her clothes fitted to a body that was visibly leaving. The chamber was full. Ottawa had come to watch, and among the watchers were other dial painters, there to learn from her case what their own were worth. The arbitrator for the Illinois Industrial Commission, George Marvel, heard medical testimony that no longer left room for the old defenses. Dr. Loeffler testified to what his examinations had found. Physicians described the radium fixed in her bones and what it had done to her blood, her jaw, her hips. The X-rays were entered, and at one point in the proceedings, the record descended from science to something older and more direct. The fragments of her own jawbone that Catherine had kept at home were produced and shown and became part of the evidence. There are trial exhibits, and there are moments when a tribunal is simply shown what a company did. This was the second kind. One absence in that chamber deserves its own sentence. Radium Dial sent lawyers. Across all the hearings, no senior official of the company sat in the room to face the woman its studio had poisoned. The chair where accountability would have sat was occupied by counsel, objecting on schedule. Institutions rarely confess, they delegate. At one point she was asked to explain how the painting had been done. Those present recalled her showing the room the old motion, the brush drawn to a point at the lips, the gesture she had performed thousands of times a week for 9 years. A demonstration takes seconds. This one carried 16 years of instruction, reassurance, and denial inside it, performed by the woman it had killed, in front of the tribunal, deciding what that was worth. Radium Dial's lawyer cross-examined her as she failed in front of the room. She answered what she could. Partway through, describing what the disease had taken, her composure and then her body gave out, and she collapsed, weeping and fainting, and the hearing could not continue in that room. What followed had, as far as anyone could tell, no precedent in Illinois. The tribunal moved to her. The arbitrator, the lawyers, the stenographer, and the press reassembled at her bungalow on East Superior Street. Catherine Donahue gave the rest of her testimony from her own bed, propped on pillows, her husband and children in the house around her. From that bed, she told the commission what the studio had been like, and what the company had said, and what her life had become. The newspapers carried it across the country. Photographs from those weeks show her impossibly thin, her husband kneeling by the bed, her 2 small children brought in to see her. She testified in the plain currency of a family's arithmetic. Her medical care had consumed the family's savings. Her husband's wages could not carry the debt. She was not asking the state of Illinois for vindication. She was asking it to keep her children fed after she died. In April of 1938, the arbitrator ruled. The news reached East Superior Street by telephone, and reporters reached it soon after, and the photographs from that day show the strange grammar of the whole story compressed into one room. A woman too weak to sit up, smiling, a husband trying to smile with her, a ruling that could not restore one cell of her body, received like a resurrection, because it said in the state's own voice that she had been telling the truth. Radium Dial was liable. The award came to about $5,600, a mixture of compensation, medical costs, and a small annual pension for life, whatever life meant in her case. Measured against what had been taken, the number was almost an insult. Measured against every verdict that had come before it, it was a landmark. An American tribunal had ruled on the merits that a radium company owed a dial painter for poisoning her, not settled quietly on the courthouse steps, ruled. The company appealed within days. This is the part of the Ottawa story that turns endurance into the entire contest. Radium Dial's strategy was not to win the argument but to outlive the plaintiff, because a dead claimant with an unresolved case is cheap. Grossman understood the strategy perfectly, and so, by every account, did Catherine. The appeals went up through the commission and the courts, and each round consumed weeks she did not have. On the 6th of July, 1938, the full Industrial Commission met in special session, took further testimony, threw out the company's appeal, and added another $730 to the award. Catherine was by then too weak to leave her bed at all. She survived long enough to be told that the commission had denied the company unanimously. Grossman brought the news to East Superior Street himself, and there was, by the accounts of those present, something like a small celebration at the bedside, reporters included, a dying woman thanking the people who had believed her. Her letters from these months survive, many of them to her friend and fellow painter, Pearl Payne, written in a careful hand that grew fainter through the spring. They are not the letters of a symbol. They are the letters of an exhausted woman, worrying about her children, her husband, her friends' cases, and her God, in roughly that order. The next day, the 26th of July, Radium Dial's attorneys filed the next appeal in the series. Catherine Donahue died on the 27th of July, 1938, in her bedroom on East Superior Street, with the case still in motion above her. She was buried from St. Columba's, the church she had walked to all her life, and the pallbearers and the pews held the story in miniature. Dial painters attended in whatever health remained to them. Charlotte Purcell, who had given her left arm to the same studio, mourned a friend whose fight was also her own fight, carried forward now by a widower with 2 children and a Chicago lawyer working without fees. The dying did not stop the case. Grossman kept it alive through appeal after appeal, 8 in all by the end, and the company lost every one of them. The Illinois courts upheld the award, and in the autumn of 1939, the Supreme Court of the United States declined to disturb the result, and the matter was finally, permanently closed. The family's recovery, when the machinery finished, was modest, and collecting from a company that had spent years thinning itself was its own grim chapter. But the principle stood on the books, paid for at full price. An employer who poisons a worker answers for it. It had taken 21 years from Grace Fryer's first day on Alden Street to a final, unappealable American judgment saying so. It is fair to ask what all of it changed, because the honest answer is layered, and this film owes precision to the women it has followed. The clearest change was legal. Illinois had rewritten its occupational disease law in 1936, while the Ottawa cases were building. The Radium litigation in both states became the reference point that pushed occupational disease coverage from a narrow list toward a general principle across the country. The New Jersey argument that Raymond Barry had pioneered, that the clock on an invisible injury cannot start before the injured person could know of it, worked its way over the following decades into the doctrine American courts now call the discovery rule. Every worker and every patient who has ever sued over a slow harm discovered late stands, usually without knowing it, in a line that begins with 5 women in Newark and a bedroom in Ottawa. The lineage runs forward through the century's great toxic reckonings. When workers poisoned by asbestos sued decades after exposure, their lawyers argued discovery. When states and smokers took on tobacco, the architecture of proving that a company privately knew what it publicly denied had a founding American precedent, and it involved paintbrushes. The Radium cases taught the law 2 lessons it has never fully unlearned. Slow harm is still harm, and a corporation's own files are the best witness against it, which is why the fight over who keeps and who sees such files never really ended, in any industry, down to the present day. The second change was scientific, and it is the strangest part of the legacy. The dial painters became the most important group of people in the history of internal radiation science, precisely because the company's assurances had turned them into an unrepeatable human experiment. Radium in bone announces itself to instruments for as long as the bone exists. So researchers measured the dial painters for the rest of the century, the living and the dead. From their bodies they built the fundamental tables of what swallowed radioactivity does to a human being over a lifetime. The man who did the most to turn their suffering into numbers was a physicist named Robley Evans, who began measuring radium in living dial painters in the 1930s and carried the work forward for half a century. His measurements, built on Martlin's methods and the painters' bodies, produced the first defensible answer to the question the industry had spent a decade dodging. How much radium in a human body is too much? The answer, formalized in 1941 by the National Bureau of Standards, was 1/10 of 1/1,000,000th of a gram, a tolerance limit derived substantially from what the dial painters' skeletons had revealed. It was, in effect, the first body burden standard for any radioactive substance in history. The timing was not academic. War was coming, and with it, the greatest luminizing boom the industry would ever see. Thousands of women painted instrument dials through the Second World War, for aircraft panels and compasses and gauges, and they did it under the new rules. No lip pointing, ventilation, covered trays, monitoring, medical checks. The wartime painters, by and large, lived. Every one of those uneventful careers was the New Jersey and Illinois Women's Monument, invisible precisely because it worked. And when the Manhattan Project confronted a new bone-seeking element in plutonium, its health physicists reached directly for the radium standard as their template, and the dial painters, without ever being asked, helped set the safety rules of the atomic age. Radium itself was phased out of consumer dials by the late 1960s, replaced by safer materials, and the trade that had made the ghost girls quietly cease to exist. The third change is the one the companies would least have predicted. The evidence outlived everyone. In 1968, the Argonne National Laboratory, outside Chicago, established a center whose mission was to find every living former dial painter and every recoverable deceased one and measure them. The study ran for 25 years. Investigators traced thousands of the women, took breath samples in living rooms across the Midwest, and, with families' consent, exhumed some of the dead. For the living, the study meant a strange late chapter. Women in their 70s and 80s, grandmothers who had painted dials as teenagers, traveled to the laboratory outside Chicago to lie inside whole-body counters, machines built in part because of them, reading the radium still resident in their bones after 60 years. Some went willingly, wanting their histories counted. Some went angrily, and said so to the researchers, because the government measuring them so carefully now had been nowhere when the measuring could have saved their friends. Both responses were correct. The scientists wrote both down. In 1978, they came for Peg Looney, 49 years after the company's doctors had written diphtheria over her body and closed the lid. The federal team measured her remains and found radium at a concentration on the order of 1,000 times the level considered safe. The family that had spent half a century with a lie on a death certificate finally received, from government instruments, the true cause of a 24-year-old's death. When her remains were returned for reburial, the container had to be lined with lead. Her family had, in a sense, been correct all along, and now the correction was federal, printed, and permanent. There is one more date from 1978 that belongs beside that exhumation, because the two facts explain each other. 1978 was also the year the dial painting industry finally left Ottawa. Luminous Processes, the successor firm that Radium Dial's president had helped establish across town in the 30s, had gone on painting dials in Ottawa for more than 4 decades after Catherine Donahue's case. It closed under regulatory pressure at last, cited for contamination, the final working remnant of the trade in the town. Hold those two events in one frame. In the same year that federal scientists were measuring the radium in a woman buried in 1929, the industry that put it there was still, barely, an Ottawa employer. Which brings the story to what remains. Because a substance with a 1,600-year half-life does not exit history when the people do. It converts into geography. In New Jersey, the orange plant site and the material that had passed through it became a federal cleanup problem of the first order. Waste from radium processing had been sold and spread as fill dirt decades earlier, and it had ended up under lawns and porches and basements across Orange and the neighboring towns. When instruments went looking in the 1980s, they found elevated readings under hundreds of homes, streets where families had raised generations over tailings. The remediation, house by house, soil load by soil load, ran for decades and cost sums that reached into the hundreds of millions. Crews in protective gear excavated yards where children had grown up, hauled the soil away by the trainload, and replaced it clean. The last of the work outlived everyone who had painted a dial in orange. The paint had been cheap, the dirt was not. Ottawa's version was the same story with a Midwestern accent. The old high school building that housed the studio was eventually torn down, and its rubble, still carrying its dust, was used as fill around town, the way rubble is. The contamination seeded more than a dozen sites across a small city, and federal cleanup crews were still excavating radioactive soil from Ottawa in the 21st century, within living memory of women who had painted there. A town of 18,000 people spent parts of 10 decades, one way or another, paying for a paint studio that operated for about 15 years. The human ledger is harder to total, and this film owes honesty about where the record runs out. The confirmed dial painter deaths from the classic era, the jaw necrosis and anemias of the 20s and 30s, number in the dozens across the two states. Behind them stands a larger, blurrier count. Radium in bone raises the lifetime risk of bone cancers and rare cancers of the skull. The argon data shows exactly that excess in the dial painter cohort. Those deaths arrived 20, 30, 50 years after the studio, scattered across the Midwest and the Northeast under ordinary diagnoses. How many women in total the industry killed is not a number the surviving record can produce cleanly. The honest statement is narrower. Every reliable count that exists is a floor, not a ceiling. And the record shows something else, which deserves saying because it is true. Not all of them died young. Some dial painters carried their radium for long lifetimes, into their 80s and 90s, defying every actuarial table built from their own cohort. Marie Rossiter of Ottawa, who had painted beside Catherine Donahue and joined her fight, lived into the 1990s. Radiation injury is probabilistic, not personal. It rolls dice in the bone for decades. The survivors were not spared by fairness. They were spared by chance. And several of them spent their spare decades doing interviews, keeping papers, and refusing to let the story be forgotten, which is part of why this film can exist. So the question this film opened with can finally be answered in full. How does a document like the Drinker Report stay hidden while people die? The mechanics turned out to be ordinary. A company owns the study it paid for. A State Department files what it is sent. A death certificate says what the signing doctor writes, and a company doctor can be the signing doctor. Silence was purchasable at every point where the record was thin. That is the whole method, and there was nothing brilliant about it. But the method had a flaw, and the flaw is the real ending of this story. It required that every copy stay controlled, forever, and records refused to live that way. Cecil Drinker kept his version and published it. Alice Hamilton wrote the letters that connected the versions. Catherine Wiley kept her door-to-door lists. Catherine Schaub filed her complaint and then wrote her book. Harrison Martland kept his measurements and his terrible list. Leonard Grossman kept the transcripts, and his family preserved them for the archives where they sit today. And the women themselves kept the most durable records of all, in the one place the company could never edit. Their own bones held the evidence, at a concentration instruments can read across centuries. That every clean story the industry ever filed was eventually outvoted by a skeleton. The state file in Trenton once said that every girl was in perfect condition. Federal instruments pressed against exhumed remains, half a century later returned a different finding, in numbers, with error bars, permanently. Between those two documents sits everything this film has tried to show. The first one took a typist an afternoon. The second one took the women the rest of their lives, and then some. What did they win? Not time. The 5 in New Jersey got their settlements and their pensions and died on schedule. Catherine Donahue got her award read to her in a bed she never left. Her family's recovery, after the appeals were exhausted and the company's assets were chased, came to a fraction of what her care had cost. Measured as compensation, the whole legal history is almost a mockery. Measured as recognition, it is something else. Courts and commissions of their own country said, on the record, over the industry's objection, that these women were telling the truth. Everything after that, the occupational disease laws, the discovery rule, the workplace radiation standards, the atomic age safety codes, built on their data, is that recognition compounding. For decades, Ottawa did not much want to talk about any of it. The story was a wound in a small town's pride, tangled up with employers and neighbors and things said at the time. The push to build a memorial came, in the end, not from an institution, but from a schoolgirl. A local student named Madeline Pillar took up the cause of the forgotten painters and campaigned until the town raised the money. It took a child to make the town remember, which the dead women, who had been called girls their whole working lives, might have appreciated. In the fall of 2011, the town of Ottawa unveiled a bronze statue at the corner near where the old studio stood. It is a young woman of the 1920s, life-sized, standing on a clock face. She holds a paintbrush in one hand and a wilted tulip in the other. Dial painters' descendants attended the dedication, and so did one or two of the very last women who had worked in the later, safer studios. Old women now, who remembered the rooms. The element itself kept collecting installments from everyone who had loved it. Marie Curie died in 1934 of aplastic anemia, her blood destroyed by a lifetime among her discoveries. Her laboratory notebooks are stored today in lead-lined boxes in Paris, and researchers who wish to consult them sign acknowledgments of the risk, because the paper will remain radioactive for more than 1,000 years. The parallel is exact and should be said plainly. The century keeps the notebooks of the scientist and the skeletons of the factory girls under the same conditions, for the same reason. Radium does not distinguish between the hand that discovered it and the hands that painted it, and neither does time. The statue is the last public trace, but it is not the last record. The last records are quieter. A published study from 1925 with a Harvard name on it, a box of transcripts in a Chicago archive, a federal data set that health physicists still consult when they need to know what a bone-seeking element does to a human being across a lifetime. Knowledge that exists because nobody warned the people it was measured in. And in 2 cemeteries in New Jersey, and in a scattering of graveyards along the Illinois River, a group of women who have been dead for 90 years. They are still, faintly and precisely, announcing what was done to them to any instrument that asks. The company said every girl was in perfect condition. The girls are still testifying otherwise, 1,600 years at a time.